So what we're looking at, assuming that the vehicle hitches, is an image that J.M.W. Turner painted in 1840, um, quite early on in his career as a painter, and it signalled his entry into a world of professional success because he painted it for the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy for people to really see him as an up-and-coming talent. It's characteristic of lots of the things that we later associate with Turner's work. It's a stormy sea. There's a great deal of use of light imagery in the picture. You can tell that he's been influenced by early sort of continental pre-impressionist painters because there's a rawness and a movement to the way he's painting. But also he's very British in his sense of subject matter. I mean, Skeat's pictures are archetypally a British painting subject. And also he's developing his own understanding of nature in a kind of conversation with the Romantic movement of English writers. And there are parallels between Turner and people like Wordsworth and people like John Ruskin. And in fact, after that exhibition at the Royal Academy, where this was first exhibited, John Ruskin bought this painting as a symbol for him of a sense of what nature could become and how nature could be portrayed on a canvas. Now, there's a very consistent use of colour here, and there's a very powerful use of colour here. And I think that adds to the drama of the approaching typhoon on the left side of the screen. And yet the light in the centre of the screen is rather unreal and rather unnatural because it comes from a variety of direction. I suppose that gives you a central focus point, but the seascape overall and that sense of storminess coming in from either side of the painting dwarfs absolutely everything else. And there's a sense of beauty and the power of nature here, but there's also a sense of something else that is wrong with, because in among all the light and the brightness and the intensity of the images of the natural world, and particular, in addition to those stunning uses of colour, which are a real hallmark of everything Turner does. I mean, the oranges and the yellows and the reds, and the blacks and the purples of the sea. In addition to all that, there is a very unnatural image of horror interspersed through and at the heart of the painting. I'm just going to zoom in, if I'm able to do that, ship, so you can see what I mean about the first of the horrors at the heart of this painting, because the ship is fighting for her life. It sails down and with decks awash with water and a real sense of being overwhelmed by the power of the storm here. But that's not the most horrible part of the painting. You can see in the waters, just in the form, but somehow slightly overshadowed by the power of the natural world imagery, you can see hands reaching out and chains, and you can see limbs and chains and a feeding frenzy, because what this painting also depicts, as well as a storm at sea, as well as a typhoon coming on, is an image that was inspired by the Zong massacre. And about 60 years before Turner painted this picture, this story was incredibly powerful in the British press. The master of the slave ship, the Zong, was of drinking water. And there's no hint in accounts of what happened that there was also a typhoon coming on. But in fear of his ship being unable to continue its voyage across the Atlantic, he threw 132 slaves to drown in the depths of the ocean. And so in the foreground of Turner's picture, you have an image of the other destructive force of the sea, if you like, of what happened to those slaves as they died, but far more horrifically, the destruction of human greed and the effect of callous indifference to human life in the way that men and women and children were chucked over the side of the ship to drown. And here in Turner's imagination, to be feasted on by the monsters of the deep. And there's a particularly evocative, horrific, Jonah-like sea monster that looms out of the waves at this point in the bottom right hand of the picture, just to really emphasize the alienness of everything that he's painting. The most disturbing aspect of the story of the Zong massacre, which really did shock public opinion at the time and has this echo years later when Turner was inspired by it to paint, was the fact that not only did the slaving captain murder 132 slaves, but then when the Zong docked, its owners attempted to claim for the loss of those slaves as property on their insurance. And there was a running battle in the courts over the next few years to determine whether those goods, those possessions, as they were thought to be, could be something where the slavers would receive an insurance payout as compensation. This hugely publicized legal case legislators and parliamentary action, first to limit the number of slaves that could be carried by a slaver to prevent this kind of running out of again, and then to stop any insurance body paying out for a kind of authorized slave murder character. We're going to hear a little bit more about that later on when I talk about our next image and about the other things that the Zong case inspired. But that Gothic horror forms the backdrop to the whole of the scene. Edward, did you want to say something? I see you've unmuted.
Yes, can anybody hear me? Nobody? Yes, you can hear me. Okay. Is it possible to take the picture back to its full picture, or are we stuck with that one? Can we go back to the original picture in its fullness?
Hopefully the full one now.
That's it. Actually, this is in the
full picture.
Yeah, that's right. Well, more or less. The picture, I think, is in Trafalgar Square, the National Gallery. Okay, and you can see it better I think it's in the National Gallery. Yeah, and you can see it better when you see it for real. And what is evident in the opinion of a lot of people is that very bright light, the one central and coming down, and then the light going crossways, is representative of a cross, the rugged cross, an emblem of shame, really. I don't know how the song goes, rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And a lot of people think that that is so. I don't know whether you can see it, in fact, but I can see it. And it's the brightest part of the picture.
Yeah, I think that comes through quite clearly, Edward. Thank you.
Can I come in? Because I'm not sure this is the same one, but there's a very similar painting in the Tate. And it's basically, it's a painting that was actually stopped from being shown by the Royal Academy. It was so shocking. Right. And actually it's got a lot of scratches in it if you look closely. And actually, from looking at what it says in the Tate, the painting was that he'd done was related to a transportation ship where 100 women and children were lost at sea. It looks slightly different to this one, but because it's got more, it's more scratchy and more it's more shocking than this. But it seems like something that Turner did, but actually some of his work wasn't shown because it was so shocking.
I think there must be several paintings which are quite similar, because this particular one, I believe, is currently in Boston in the Museum of Fine Arts there. But I believe that there are similar images which have that same kind of theme of death and horror as a result of slavery. I mean, one of the really interesting things about its life after being painted is that it was exhibited again in shortly after 1840 at the start of the World Anti-Slavery Congress Convention, which was an attempt to kickstart a big nationwide campaign against slavery in America. And so, as well as the inspiration 60 years before the Zong massacre, which really does activate British anti-slavery activists, this is art 60 years later with the same sort of passionate horror at the evils of slavery, attempting to kickstart a new wave of activism. And in a sense, it's an incredibly large, expensive picture. So it's art for the few people that can afford this kind of interaction and ownership with real painterly expertise. But because it and images like it were exhibited so widely and at these kind of congresses and conventions, it's also art in itself as activism on a wider scale for people who are trying to be influencers and want to take those kind of images and really use them to change the whole world. It's working on two levels in just its imagery and in what it looks like, with the contrast between the natural world and its beauty and the awfulness of the events it depicts. And it's also working on those two levels too, it being a piece of beautiful fine art, but in trying to get into the hearts and minds and into the pockets of everyday working people to support these big anti-slavery campaign movements. I did think of one or two sort of little questions about the image that we might use in a time of discussion now, either all together. Let's see how that goes first. But if that's a bit intimidating, I can always split us up into little discussion breakout rooms. But I thought the first thing really would just be to share how, when we look at this image with all that complexity, it makes us feel. Would anyone like to share how looking at it makes them feel today? And if you'd like to, do just unmute and wait for a gap in the conversation, and then let me know.
Yes, well, I'll put my hand up. Yeah. Makes me go back to what I was saying about the cross. In Ruskin's words, you already mentioned Ruskin. John Ruskin was the most listened to and one of the greatest art critics of his time. And he really loved this picture. And he said, if I had to restrict one painting to this man's immortality, it would be this one. And I think it's a terribly important picture. And what I'm wondering, one of the questions that I want to ask is about Turner himself. I know he was baptized, and I think he was from an Anglican background, and I know he's in St. Paul's Cathedral. Incidentally, this picture is in America. It's in Boston. It's not in the, where I said, in the National Gallery. But what do we know of Turner's religious leanings, if anything? Because he didn't write very much, did he? Hence,
I'm not sure. Would anyone else
did this cross appear by design or by accident, and it's only imagined? Sorry to be so difficult.
I think he was baptised, as most babies would have been baptised, you know, a few days old, at the church in Covent Garden. I think he had a funeral at St Paul's Cathedral, but he was baptised at that St Paul's, Covent Garden, just a few days old. I think there are records of that. I don't think he was particularly observant in terms of religious life. But his father was from Devon, interestingly. So he went, he had a Devon father. He had family in Devon, just on the side.
You want to call?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Can I?
Maybe I can help on Turner's religion. As far as I remember, Turner was really, he was interested in religion, but he, in many of his paintings, he made paintings that teased or laughed at Roman Catholic processions or rituals. I remember sketches of his of processions of monks in Tivoli and other sketches of monks in France. That wasn't unusual in his period in England, where there was a strong Protestant sentiment in the arts. So you see also in early Romantic Gothic literature and also later in novels and things like that, the godly Protestant that is quite sober, and there's a sense of religion that is not at all linked to ritual and things like that, opposed to the superstitious and the dangerous and the corrupt monasticism, usually represented by monasticism, Roman Catholicism. So I think he would have said that he was a godly Protestant, that Alec, better than me, probably can describe that as an historian of the church, that kind of sentiment of the age that I think he would have Turner would have expressed.
Mark, you wanted to comment on this as well.
So basically, Ruskin's an interesting character because Ruskin was influential in a lot of this stuff, but actually Ruskin inherited a lot of his drawings and actually destroyed a lot of his drawings because he didn't think they were appropriate. I think Ruskin used to, I think Turner used to frequent brothels and do drawings in brothel scenes and stuff. And a lot of that artwork was actually destroyed by Ruskin. So I think Turner's religious beliefs were, pretty unclear, really. But I think his political persuasions around the abolition of slavery was quite clear. I think he was anti-slavery, but also he was anti-transportation as well. So I think that's just worth considering. But the other thing that's interesting is the work that he inspired other artists, such as John Sell Cotman and people like that. And John Sell Cotman spent a lot of time touring Normandy, painting the churches and various aspects. And he was able to do that because he was able to get up into the eaves, because a lot of the French had actually put false ceilings into churches, so he was able to get up into the ceilings and do a lot of the paintings of the artwork and the in churches in Normandy. But he was inspired a lot by Turner as well. So it's an interesting one, really. I'm not sure his religious beliefs were that clear, really.
What about in this image? Is this for is this for everybody who's looking at it now? Is this a moral picture for you?
I think it's an attempt at a protest picture, isn't it? Really, it could be viewed in the most indirect sense as one of the roots of the American Civil War. You know, it was a movement gathering momentum. But I think the thing that we haven't said about Turner was a most unusual man. I mean, he was obviously not without a certain amount of courage. He was the chap who lashed himself, or had himself lashed, to the foremast of a ship in a gale so that he'd have a real experience of what it was like to be on deck during a storm. But the other thing is that what we're seeing here, even if you leave the slavery element out of it, is a bit like somebody these days producing a beautiful painting of the crash of an airliner. You know, you think of Lockerbie, somebody had gone along and painted bits of body all over Lockerbie. It would be regarded as rather shocking. And I think at the time, the sea travel was so important, particularly to Britain, that you didn't want to dwell on the fact that it often went wrong. And of course he did, which was a bit shocking. But there were lots of other pictures, you know, Jericho's Raft of the Medusa and things like this, which were very questionable in terms of whether they were going to get publicly exhibited, because they were so shocking to think that something actually might go wrong on an ocean voyage.
And there is a question looking at the picture. I don't know if anyone would like to say how they feel about this issue, about where the conflict is at its deepest in the image that Turner gives us here. Is it, and I think Derek, is it about a confrontation between nature and human transportation? Is it also, or more or less, about the conflict between humans and between the powerful and the vulnerable? It works on different levels, as you say, because it's such a large piece.
I wonder about the bright line through the center of the painting. And to me, it's as though it's dividing it into two. There's like a division. And so from what you were saying, Alec, there are a number of divisions to be seen, but it's, that's what seems to strike me. I just wonder why there is that, that just bright light, which could be across. I can see Edward's point there, but why is it right the way through the centre of the painting? You know, are we meant to be looking at different sides, different reasons for his painting the picture? But, I do think that it's certainly to make people think about the death of those who were slaves. I think you can't ignore that because of the manacles you can see. Yes. They're empty.
Can I come into this?
Go ahead. Yes.
Can you
Go
hear
ahead,
me?
Emma.
Yes. Going back, well, I agree with that strange division down the middle. I see that as well. But going back to Derek's point, surely today people may not paint the equivalent picture because we have photographs of all sorts of horrific events throughout the world, Lockerbie being one of them, films, newsreel films, which weren't available then. So this was probably the means of getting a visual image across.
One, of course, that Turner would not see.
And yet, Heather,
I've just
actually, as
come
Derek
across,
says,
right. I've just come across something
hang on
hot
a
off the
sec, Edward.
press,
I was
passed over by
about
my
something which was.
wife. Right.
Hang on a second, Edward. I just to answer Heather and say I think she's
Yes, sorry.
right, but as Derek was just saying, we're talking about something Turner didn't see and occurred 60 years before he painted it. So it's astonishing to think that somebody was so very, very worked up about a horrific event at that distance. Sorry, Edward, go ahead. Now let's hear what you were
I was
going
gonna
to say,
say,
passed over by your wife.
Just for everybody's, as we're ecumenical gathering, just for everybody's education, I've just discovered on another iPad, I'll read it. As a child, he was sent to a Methodist school in Margate, but as a young man, there are accounts of him eschewing church in favour of continuing to sketch. I don't know whether that tells us anything. I think it's rather amusing.
Probably says a bit about education in the 19th century.
Alec, can I just say that I'm picking up on the point about you wouldn't see this today. I think Picasso did something very similar with Guernica. And I think there are artists that actually do use the visual arts to express that. I think Banksy does that with his artwork and on the wall in Jerusalem and down the West Bank. So there are still artists that use that, you know, this sort of material and this media to actually express their anger and their frustration at what they see as unjust.
I think that I think the just thought is, do you see the elements in the painting to be to share the condemnation, to a moral value, to be present as something there? Or do you see the sun and the clouds and the sky just as things that are there but don't have any emotion? That is, do you think is describing a spiritual nature that takes part in things? So do you think that it's just a background and all that is not interested into human issues?
Can I say something? I think
It goes back to Ed, idea of the cross. Go ahead, Carol.
I don't think it is.
I think that actually, when looking at the colours of the sky and the shape of the reds and the oranges, it looks to me like a broken heart, really. And that's what that line down the centre is as well. That it's a heart that's broken by what goes on.
I think the scratchiness, and if you see this in reality, the scratchiness and the actual, the way it comes off the canvas, actually it jumps out at you, the horror in the foreground. If you see it as an image here, you're drawn to the light, but actually, when you see it on a canvas, you're drawn to the texture that he puts onto the canvas, and you can't but see the horror that's there at the beginning, at the lower right hand side.
I recently read a book of historical fiction by Laura Shepherd Robinson called Blood and Sugar. It's a fairly recent publication, but it's a work of fiction. The whole background is this incident at the sea, and it talks about the initial cover-up and then into the court case where they wanted to regard the slaves as cargo. So it gives you a lot of background in that book, as lots of historical authors do.
Well, have we done that one,
I think
Alec?
that's really lovely to share, because yeah, I was just going to say, Edward, it's really lovely to share that link to literary fiction, because that's doing, in a sense, what Turner was doing, of at a distance giving us an emotional, visceral response. A different kind of response is one that I think you will feel when we move on to our next image. Can everybody see this plaque? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can just see the Am I Not a Man and a Brother plaque? Lovely. Let me just tell you a little about this, and then we'll have some more time for discussion again. And let's hope that the internet from the vicarage doesn't completely collapse while we're doing this. This is a Jasper Ware plaque with an embossed image placed onto it with plaster. It was made in the factory owned by Josiah Wedgwood in Stoke-on-Trent by a man called William Hackwood, and he did lots of portraiture work at the Wedgwood factory. So all those famous Jasper Ware plates with images of kings and queens on them are by the same team, and indeed by the same moulding artist. He would have been the person whose job it was to create the reverse moulds for the images and then shape them onto the Jasper Ware before they were fired. And in fact, we know it was modelled by William Hackwood because, as well as details on the front, we get his name on the reverse of, and you can also see just here in a very clumsy bit of modification, the plaster work that's glued to the initial plaque image. And there's Hackwood's name on the obverse side, along with the British Museum catalogue number, because that's where this particular image is from. It's, in a sense, quite similar in provenance to the slave picture, because what we have here is something that is a piece of activist art and part of a campaign to incite other people to activism against slavery. But it's much earlier than the image by JMW. This was made about 1790 or so. It was based on the logo, the seal of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which Josiah Wedgwood drew for them. About a year after that society was founded, when he was becoming a really influential member of its central committee. And that society was founded in 1783, mainly as a response and Unitarians and Anglicans and Baptists to news reports in the press of the Zong massacre. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start with the Turner image and then move on to this, because although this is earlier, chronologically speaking, it's a response to what we've just been seeing. This kind of image, which Wedgwood designed and sketched out as the seal of this Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, gets put on plaques like this, and cufflinks and pins and badges to go on people's hats and snuff boxes. And Thomas Clarkson, who was a member of that society and very prominent in its propagandistic efforts to attack the foundations of the slave trade, has a wonderful quotation where he talks about ladies wearing these images and others having them fitted up, smaller plaques than this, but having them fitted up as hat pins and hairpins. And so the taste for wearing these images united fashion with causes of justice and social conscience, humanity and freedom. This, in a sense, is art that is being produced for wide consumer ownership and for really kind of fashionable forms of consumption. So in a sense, it's the kind of stuff you'd be able to buy in a museum gift shop now. And it's art also as activism, and art that is incredibly successful in its activism, because you find of these and other images like it surviving from the end of the 18th and early 19th century. And there's a real intimate connection between the printed propaganda and the speeches and the parliamentary action for the abolition of the slave trade and these kind of images. On the one hand, they disseminate the message of the anti-slavery movement incredibly widely in Britain and then in France and America too, because Wedgwood sent some of these images across the Atlantic to help activate an anti-slavery campaign in the States. but also because the profits from their sale, when they weren't being ripped off at least, because there are lots of fakes and forgeries around, the profits from their sale were funded by Wedgwood's factory into the work of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And of course, we know that as a result of those campaigns, there are acts for the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and then for the emancipation of slaves within the British colony, 1833, and the activism spreads from parliamentary and popular campaigners into the heart of the British establishment and into the work of the British Navy in attacking the slave trade at sea. These images have been called the most successful piece of political propaganda ever devised. And I think I've got some images of them as jewelry and snuff boxes that I can show you. Oh, here is the same image being used on the cover of a book, The Princess of Zamfara, exposing the African side of the origins of the slave trade. And here it is again on a snuff box, a really cheaply produced one. You can see there's this sense that it's a universal icon of anti-slavery, and the kind of image that, because it's so moving and effective and iconic in its simplicity, is also the kind of image that's instantly recognizable whether it's being reproduced. There's an original of the image, which I can also show you, Wedgwood's sketch, that forms the center of the plaque that is the real focus of our discussion. But you can see how there's a real detail there and a real sense of pathos, but also a real sense of simplicity in the way he's designed something that's going to be instantly recognizable and instantly clear what the message that the image conveys is. Would anyone like to just give a little bit of feedback on how they feel about that image, the plaque in particular, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? Because I think otherwise I can get incredibly overcomplicated as we talk about it a bit. But I just wondered if anyone would like to share how it makes them feel.
I think
I don't know that I could presume to do that, Alec, because I'm not always sure that I know how I feel. But the key point here, surely, is that the basic message of this is absolutely fundamental. The nature of humanity, the nature of people, is that they will do just about anything to their fellow man if they fail to recognize that he is their fellow man. And then that was the Untermenschen that the Nazis depended on for the Holocaust. The idea that these people aren't actually cargo, but were fellow human beings. I mean, this was the key message. And it would have been more of an act of persuasion than perhaps these days we think, because I think we all take that basic hypothesis for granted. But I think an awful lot of people didn't. And an awful lot of people in the south of the USA didn't for a lot longer than the period we're talking about. So I think it was a very important persuader.
I think...
Oh, too long to come.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I wanted to say that I think although the chains might not be there anymore, I listened to a group of black colleagues last week, and I was really struck by the fact that people feel scared when they walk out the door that they might be stopped by the police, and that's a real it's a real concern still. And so it reminds me that although there are chains there, we still have a long way to go to make black people free and equal members of our society. And I think that's something that really, you know, I mean, slave trade was abolished, and actually a lot of people, that's a good thing. But I remember hearing Joy DeGoy, who's a psychologist from America, who talked about the post-traumatic slave syndrome. And that is, it takes generations and generations to overcome the effects of slavery. And I think that's the thing that sort of makes me realise we still, the chains are there, but actually the chains might not be there now, but there are invisible chains that are still there for Black people.
Well, I
Thanks,
think,
Mark.
you know, we very much need that kind of image. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, but
Yes, we can hear you,
I'm
Laura.
I'm convinced really it's needed more than ever. You know, when I was a child, and I appreciate that was a long time ago, you know, I can remember these notices up on walls: no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. You know, when they people were trying to find accommodation. And there's still, in some quarters, a great deal of opposition to immigration. And, you know, I have heard very recently the opinion that it's all these migrants coming in that are causing the pandemic. You know, so I think it's a tremendous amount of work still to be done to educate.
To me, it makes think
Go ahead.
that, in a sense, there was something different in the slavery of the time, in that it made people not human beings, that therefore made the type of slavery different from, say, the slavery that was common that was still awful, but the same was common in Europe or up to the early modern age of white people, say in the Ottoman Empire. Like, from a lot of Sicilians nowadays, 2 or 3% of them would trace the descendant from white slaves from the Caucasus and things like that. But I think that there was still a sense that those slaves were, if not Christians, people that anyway would have been Christian and would have been baptized, and on baptism lost the state as slaves. Whereas the difference in color of skin made people in favor of slavery able to dehumanize at a different level slaves than in previous ages. So it's scary, because you see this kind of representation of a person as a slave.
One of the things that, in a sense, is most shocking about this image, if I go back to this particular enlargement now, is connected with that idea that Derek and Francesca have both talked about, of making Black people to justify their enslavement, is the very image and inscription that we have on this piece of art, because there isn't an assertion of equality or empowerment around the person on the plaque. He is asking and begging and pleading to be recognized with the question, am I not a man and a brother? Rather than simply saying that he is. And that comes through very strongly in the original drawing as well. There's that image of supplication and of desperation, and therefore also of implied inferiorities of art. And so lots of people think this is a wonderful, iconic piece of art that's deeply involved with freeing slaves, but also there's something that makes me quite uncomfortable about it. I don't think it's a sort of deep, insoluble ethical problem, but I think it is worrying that it's phrased as a question when that man on his knees before his white owner or potential savior is asking for recognition as being at the most basic level recognizable as a human being. Feel about that question of how comfortable we should be with that attitude, or does it not matter because this kind of art is effective, and of course slavery does enforce inferiority? That's the whole issue. If you'd like to share something, do just unmute yourself and come in on that question.
Is there something about the fact that this is coming from white people? And at the time, there were black people who were speaking up and writing accounts and actually coming together with colleagues and with church and with churches and with non-conformist churches to actually campaign for the abolition of slavery. And we're quite successful at it. People like Aldo Aquino, who wrote the narrative of that, and actually were quite clear about what the issues were. That there is this thing about, you know, for, of, and with, and it's something that you know, is something that this is for black people, but it's, you know, it's not of black people or with them. If you see what I mean.
That's really well put, Mark. Thank you for sharing that. If any of you have seen David Olusega's excellent documentary, Black and British, I think you'll have a sense of what Mark is talking about in terms of the British black people who campaigned actively against the slave trade. Or if you've been to or heard about some of the National Trust's recent works to change some of their art exhibitions to include images of black British people who were deeply rooted within the communities in the UK they lived within. There's a real contrast between the way that those people are now being depicted and this particular image that we inherit of supplicants, slaves seeking to be freed by their masters rather than deserving to be treated as equals by virtue of their common humanity. And I think, related again to what Mark's saying, there's even a problem, not a terrible one, because of course it does help to push forward the cause of abolition, but still a really inherited problem that we have in our society, because this is how we think of slaves and how we think of people who are in need of help today, as incredibly grateful and as incredibly keen to be helped, rather than seeking us to be united with them in their cause.
Yes, moving on.
How do people feel about the... Because that's another interesting aspect of the image. It's very stark. How does that strike everybody? That very black on very yellow or white jasperware.
Effective.
I think the starkness means that you can't ignore the message. You're not going to get lost in colours and things like that. It's just there. It's black on white, as they say. But and I do also wonder, you know, it's a question. Am I not a man and a brother? Is it a question to Christians? Was it a question to Christians? I mean, he's using the term brother. Was that, you should have imagined, you know, brotherly love amongst Christians. I don't know whether I'm seeing more than I should, but I just wonder.
I think that is there, Carol, because Ed was involved in the initial stages of the campaigns against slavery, would have counted themselves as their opposition in the teaching of Christ. Even Josiah Wedgwood, who I think you probably have to say was not an Orthodox Christian of any denomination, would have been echoing that. And the other members of the early committee of the Society for Slave Trade were mostly Quakers and a few Anglicans and Baptists, absolutely steeped in scripture.
John Wesley.
And one of the first things they were trying to do was to get more Christians into their campaign. Sorry, Laura, what were you going to say?
Going to say John Wesley wrote a letter on his deathbed to William Wilberforce about the abolition of slavery. So you've got to include us as well. But the other thing that worries me about this image is that many people who would call themselves Christians were quite happy to have a cute little black boy as a servant in their houses. And you know, they were regarded really as a bit of a curiosity rather than a brother, I'm afraid. You know, I think they've got the two things going on side by side.
Could I
in
say?
my humble opinion.
I know what you mean.
What worries me is
Amazing.
we're all sitting here and feeling rather contented that what we're discussing is a historical matter. And Mark has hinted that it isn't, but it isn't, because I mean, the fact is that slavery, modern slavery, is still very much a phenomenon. The basis of it is slightly different. It's also different from the slavery of the past in that you haven't got fellow citizens, if you like, of the people who are enslaved actually catching them and trapping them and selling them on to the same extent. But we still have a big slavery problem, don't we? And we can't feel smug.
Yeah.
The way they, oh, sorry.
All right. I was going to say, I want to picking up on something that Derek said a little while ago, which we skipped past, was that although this image that we have here was very successful, you know, in sort of counteracting slavery and reducing it, and we come to 1865, was it when slavery was abolished? So it did contribute a great deal, but overall, how successful has this bit of advertising, if you like, which appears on all sorts of things, been? And the thing that occurs to me about slavery is World War II and the Nazis and the Japanese, not so much the Auschwitz and the concentration camps, but the slave labor, which was enormous, and it was brought about by those two regimes. And that worries me because that's very modern and things are still going on today. So we've still got an enormous fight on our hands.
The thing that occurred to me, is it all right? When Alex said about it being posed as a question, it almost echoes the speech from Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, where he says, if you prick me, do I not bleed? If you tickle me, do I not laugh? And it's almost echoing it as supplication, as a question in the same way.
Yes, that's good.
Thanks, Margaret. I think that's a really good insight, because again, it's that impression of different ethnic groups being considered as somehow inhuman, which ties up with what Edward was saying, and also with Derek's point about the persistence of modern slavery. And perhaps one of the great legacies of these kind of images is how we encourage people into activism, but perhaps conversely, one of their negative legacies is how they allow us, even if we care about those issues, to pretend that they are things which happened hundreds of years ago and miles away to people that don't look like us, and therefore to, again, detach our humanity from the humanity of others. Well, we're just coming to the end of an hour of discussion about these two sets of images. So is there anything else that anyone would like to share? Anything that they've made you feel that's really bubbling up and you want to let out and express, or that you'd like to share with the rest of us? I can't see any hands waving excitedly or even madly. So I'm going to assume that that means everybody is really happy to have had a chance to speak and share their feelings about the images, which I think is the really valuable thing about these kind of art and faith discussions, that they lead us into inspiration and into being challenged. And into being challenged, I think this comes out really clearly from our discussion of this image in particular, to being challenged not to feel smugly self-satisfied. As British people, as people who could think about the legacy of abolition rather than the legacy of the slave trade, and also as people living in a society where we know that modern slavery still exists as a cancer gnawing away at the heart of communities and equalities. There is that question left hanging in the air: if this person is a man and a brother, then how do we treat them? And what do we do about the way other people treat them? Thank you so much for joining in the discussion so animatedly today. And I hope you found it not only challenging, because I've deliberately chosen some challenging images, but also enjoyable and rich and fulfilling. And we're going to come back next week with another opportunity to discuss some challenging ideas, as Francesco, who's our ordinand on placement at St Mary's, someone who's in training to end up as a vicar if he's really unlucky. Francesco will be leading us in a discussion of images of Jesus and the other. So again, reflecting on that theme of how images of Jesus can be challenging or comforting. Francesco, do you want to give us just a little moment of advertising for what you'll be talking about?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity, Alec, and thank you very much for your talk. That was really stimulating and great, at least as far as I'm concerned. So the talk that I will be doing, it will be about how do you imagine Jesus? How do you think about Jesus, and how the church has thought over time about Jesus, from a sort of Apollo, god of the sun, to a young boy, to a king philosopher, up to the Black Jesus that you will now see at St. Albans. Controversial, lovable, looking like us, or looking completely different from how we look. What do we think about the image of Jesus? What does he mean to us? What does he mean for our faith? So that's the subject, and I look very much forward to discuss it with such an intelligent group, at least by the conversation of today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. Excellent.
Thank you very much, Alec.
Everybody over.
Thank you very much, Alec. That was brilliant, brilliantly led and held together. Well done.
Alec, before we all disappear, could I say just one thing?
Same time, same next week. Yeah, go ahead then.